Today I'll talk about being in Oxford in the late 1970s. I just moved into this place in the centre of Oxford. In fact, it was only about less than 100 yards from the actual centre. So it's more or less the closest house you could get to the actual centre of Oxford. And across the road was Christ Church College. And then that extended into Christ Church Meadow, which was a big square meadow, often with quite wild cattle there from Scotland with big horns. And that bordered the Thames River. Before that, I was looking for a place to live. And I used to go into this religious bookstore and cafe. It was quite traditional, and quite important people in the past had spent some time in there, like Auden the poet from the 30s and 40s, and he was at Christ Church. And I used to be in there, and there's a side door where you go out into the hallway of the house next door, and then you could go out into the street. And I used to think, wouldn't it be really nice if I lived next door? You know, it'd be a really good place to live. Now, I have access to the cafe, I could go there any time. And it was also on that street, which was a very small street, Pembroke Street, was a college, Pembroke College, and also MoMA, the Modern Museum of Art, was just along there. And they had a nice cafe as well. So I went looking for a room, and I was recommended to go in that area, to a particular place, and it was called Commonwealth House, and it had several houses, and people came from all over the world, especially the Commonwealth, and studied in Oxford, and you could stay there. And they gave me a place, and it was the house next door to the cafe. So, you know, within a very short period of time, that synchronicity happened. And I suppose in many respects, that wasn't the first synchronicity I remember consciously, because I mentioned before that I didn't consider synchronicity coincidence that important. So during my early part of my life, I wouldn't have even thought of remembering things like that. It wouldn't have kind of occurred to me to put two and two together, kind of thing. But then what happened was that in 1979 until about 1982, when I lived there, a whole series of synchronicities began. So I got very interested in the subject. I was 35 at the time in 1980, and I started keeping a journal and being very interested in the symbols, which I wasn't interested in before. So up until that time, you know, the magic and mythology and symbols wasn't that important. And then in the local library in Oxford, I discovered Jung and synchronicity, etc. But prior to that, or during that time, I'd go across the road through Christ Church College and into the meadow. And I was walking from Merton Street down a small path between the colleges, Corpus Christi and Merton College. and there was a green verge, you know, a cut lawn, green lawn to the right. And as I was walking down there, for whatever reason, the grass seemed very luminous, had a certain intense, vivid greenness. It was very luminous. I was absolutely transfixed. I'd never seen anything like that before. And as I focused on the grass, I felt, again, a very luminous magnetic energy, and I felt like I was being almost drawn into the grass. It was so powerful. I had to kind of almost pull my attention away, or else I would have maybe gone unconscious. It was that powerful. Another time I'm coming down the same path. I go through the iron gates into the meadow. I'm just walking along, and I felt this energy go right through my body, from my crown right through my body, down my spine. And it's very difficult to explain, but it's almost like a kind of laser beam or a ray or something, a ray from above, penetrating right through your body. Obviously your astral body, in your physical body. And I was rooted to the ground. I had to stop, absolutely stopped. I had to wait several minutes before the shock went away. It was quite a shock. And I just stood there, again very transfixed, and just kind of like got my bearings and just carried on, and that was all right. Another time I'm sitting in the room, and again this same energy pierced me, penetrated from the crown right through my body as I sat in the chair, and again it was like a shock. It wasn't painful, it wasn't frightening, it was just like a shock. And you just had to be still. You know, if you're an animal and you're in the forest or something, and something happens, they just stand still, don't they? They freeze, what they call freeze. So in a kind of, you have the idea of fight and flight. So you either fight or you run away, flight, but you also freeze. So there's kind of three alternatives. Another time, I was going to, I think it was a lecture at one of the colleges, St. Margaret's Hall, a girls' college. And I was just walking along the streets. It was at night, very dark, very quiet. And I felt that my attention, the focus of my consciousness was shifting from my head to above my head. So I felt this shift of consciousness, awareness, from my head to above my head. And that freaked me out. And I didn't know what was going to happen, a kind of out of the body, while I was walking along. And I had to kind of talk to myself and say, well, I'm David and I'm going to the college and things are all right. And I had to re-establish my identity, my memory, basically. So all these kind of shifts of consciousness that have gone on in my life, quite dramatic, quite shocking, very numinous. I started writing plays. I got very interested in the theatre. Have quite a good theatre in Oxford. The Playhouse is really it's run by the Oxford University, but very famous plays are put on there. I remember going to see Harold Pinter, and I wrote this play about a couple of young people. They're going through difficulties, they're going to separate, two married people. And I submitted several plays to the Playhouse, and when I left that place, I needed a place to live. So I joined an art group. And in the art group I met somebody, and they found out I was looking for a place, and they let me stay there for a while. And they took me several places, and one of the places was in Walton Street, Jericho, slightly to the north of the city. And it was in a flat set on the first floor opposite the Phoenix Theatre. It's just a small local kind of art theatre. And there I met the couple that I wrote about. I met the couple. They're going through a breakdown. They were university students. And several of the people involved in that situation were in the play. And also, I'd made some tapes. I began, when I felt independent and free of Krishnamurti, and was just kind of establishing my own thoughts and my own way of looking, I made these tapes. I made one tape called The Ego, and another tape called A Neutral View. So it's just my sense of myself in the world, and reflecting on various things for the first time, just thinking about things through my own mind, you know, independent of other people and books and everything. And when I met this couple, and as I say, going through a breakdown, one of the people living next door or upstairs in another flat was part of a kind of workshop. So in the 1980s, a lot of alternative people came to Oxford because it has a really interesting atmosphere. Oxford, it's really it's a kind of small London. It's like, you know, you get the literati and the arty people and everything in London. And so Oxford's a kind of very bohemian type of place. There's a lot of bohemianism in the tradition of Oxford University. A lot of the alumni, you know, were writers and artists, philosophers and all that kind of thing. So there's a lot of that atmosphere around Oxford in the cafes and everything. And I gave one of these guys who was a filmmaker, and the guy I was staying with actually was a filmmaker, so they knew each other. And I gave him a tape called The Ego. And I met the couple that are having a breakdown. The man, well, he's only about 21 or something. I was 35 at the time, I think. And I met his brother. Now, I was part of a poetry group, and we used to meet in a pub in the evening, once a week. So I was there in the pub, and about 5 or 6 people, and in walks this young man, and he reads a poem, very interesting poem. He wasn't part of the group or anything, but he came along and just read this poem. And I don't know if I said anything to him. I read something out. I don't know if I said anything to him. And I used to hang out. My favourite place was St. Giles Cafe. And it's an avenue, and it wasn't far from the Ashmolean Museum where I used to go as a child. And that's connected to Elias Ashmole, the Rosicrucian, and he wrote on John Dee. And their portraits actually hang side by side in the museum. And that's where the Egyptian room and Akhenaten and Nefertiti and the family are shown there. So I'm going to this cafe where I was to meet people. That was my kind of hangout. And somebody turned around and said, somebody turned around and asked me, was my name so-and-so? And it was the guy from the poetry. And we were talking, and he seemed to know my name. And we got very good friends. He became my best friend, actually. And his brother actually went to Exeter College, where my best friend in a few years, Professor Roderick Main, who's my best friend now, in over 30 years, he went to Exeter College as well, in Turl Street. And this guy invited me to a tea party. They usually have it in the afternoon, 4 o'clock. You have, over in England, you have kind of cream tea, and it's a bit of a upper class thing, basically. And he was quite upper class. And I went along, and there were these people from the university. Not all of them were the university, maybe about seven or 8 people. Very nice house, old Victorian house, really nice sitting room. And I go in there, and he's got a girlfriend, and she's going to study in Russia. And he leaves the room, and it's quite bohemian types. He leaves the room, goes upstairs, and comes downstairs with a bird cage and the little bird inside. Probably, I think it was a canary, maybe a budgerigar canary. He said, "Oh, this is Mishkin." He didn't explain it, but Mishkin is a character in a 19th century novel by Dostoevsky, the Russian Dostoevsky, and he's the central character in a book called The Idiot. And really it's about this young man. He's sent away from Russia, goes to the Swiss Alps, and is being treated for some kind of illness. One assumes it's a kind of mental illness or something like that, maybe neurasthenia, in the sense of being very sensitive, very hypersensitive. A lot of kind of upper class aristocratic types were neurasthenic and nervous and highly strung. And of course, Jung was in Zurich and later, and it was basically a place. I mean, Switzerland, for the air and all of that, it was known as a kind of place where you go to be sanatoriums to be treated for various illnesses of the body, all that. And he gets treated and he comes back to Russia, and he doesn't know anybody, he has no background, and in effect he doesn't have any fixed identity. He doesn't seem to be normal, he doesn't seem to be a particular type of person, and he's kind of like a cipher, he's like a kind of non-entity, he's almost like a child, and with no memory. So he arrives, and the only contact he's got, and we don't know how that comes about, but the only contact he's got is his uncle, and he just appears at his uncle's house, and the uncle wonders what he's doing there, and doesn't know what to do about him, and he falls for this woman. When I say he falls for this woman, not necessarily sexually, romantically, I mean, there is a romantic level, but I think it's more of an infatuation with the feminine, because it's not like he's a person, like a masculine person looking for a woman. And she's a femme fatale, and she just drags him through these horrendous situations with men and drama and violence and psychopathology, real nightmare situation, and he just copes with it. He just goes through it all and he copes with it. And there's just this sense that he's never in control of his own life. He's never establishing himself as an independent person. He's just drawn along from drama to drama to drama. Anyway, so the guy comes downstairs with this bird and said it's Mishkin, and of course his girlfriend's going to Russia, so that's the kind of pun, that's the joke. And he walks over to the table, and there's a cassette recorder, and he switches on the cassette recorder, and of course my voice comes on the cassette recorder talking about the ego, and I'm talking on the tape about the ego, and I'm saying there is no such thing as the ego. There is no such thing. Wherever you look in your mind, wherever you look in yourself, you won't find the ego, because that's an invention by Freud. And really my idea is that the ego is simply a name for the identity. One has a particular identity, like, you're a lawyer or you're a doctor. That's a particular identity, or father, mother, child, student, teacher. They're just identities, but they're not fixed. You can have many identities and many personas. And that fit right into the Mishkin character. It's almost like he planned the whole thing in his own mind, but didn't tell anybody. So the people there wouldn't have necessarily made the connection between Mishkin and the tape. But in his mind, he was making that connection. And he was very surreal. He was into Jean Cocteau and Dada and surrealism. So he had that kind of sense of humour. So that was very surprising. I didn't know he had the tape. I didn't know. So what happened was, he was a filmmaker. He was at this workshop, and this other guy gave him the tape to listen to. So I meet him in this poetry group. He comes into my favourite cafe, recognises my voice, and then it turns out to be that he was at the poetry thing, and he had the tape. So it's very, very curious connections. the guy I was staying with had been to the London Film School, and while he was in London, actually his father worked for the BBC and various film companies. He was a cameraman, and this guy actually knew Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction writer, and he wrote the book 2001, and he wrote this screenplay with Stanley Kubrick. And he used to be on the phone to him in London quite often. And he was also writing a biography of Nick Rogue. And Nick Rogue made the film Far From the Madding Crowd. He made Don't Look Now with Julie Christie and Sutherland. And he made The Man That Fell to Earth with David Bowie, and a film with Mick Jagger about bohemians and all that in London. So he was writing the actual biography of this very famous avant-garde filmmaker, and he asked me if I wanted to work on it, but other things happened anyway. And he took me to London. We went to Soho, where a lot of agents and the kind of administration of the film world had offices and things. He was doing something and going around the offices. I went with him. Then he took me to this club, and it's called the Colony Club, and it was just a very small space upstairs, not particularly posh or smart or anything like that. And it was in the late afternoon, and it's been celebrated. It's been on television and everything, but it's just it's a small club, and the kind of central character there who drops in there and is well known. He was the most famous English artist, Francis Bacon, and he kind of did art in the late 40s and the 50s and right up to the 80s, and he was more or less in the style of Pablo Picasso and Surrealism. And then later in the late 80s and 90s, you got Brit art with the young English artists that were celebrated in the Turner Prize. So they were like again, bohemian types and doing outrageous things, very outrageous things. And then I got involved with people from the Golden Dawn, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and lots of things were going on with them. And the one that was running the Golden Dawn, he had a really nice magazine, an occult magazine called New at Isis, and I put some of my drawings in there, and my friend then, my new friend, which is Professor Roderick Main, my new friend, did an article on the scarab beetle and synchronicity, and what happened was that Jericho is on the just slightly to the northwest of the city, and then you can go down a road, Walton Well Road, over the railway bridge, and you come to a massive meadow, port meadow. It's probably, it's just flat grass, and it's very short. It's not cut. It's short because it's a flood meadow. So the River Thames floods the meadow for quite a few months in the year. And it's a public place, so you can actually put horses. There's lots of horses, and people with horses can let them graze there. You know, it's just open public land. I don't think you have to pay or anything. And it's probably about 400 yards wide and about 3/4 of a mile long. So it's really a big area. And we went over there and we crossed the Thames and went up the other side. It's in the summer, very hot. And we sat on the bank, and that area of the bank is very sandy. So there's some children playing around in the sand and people in the water. And I noticed that there was a broken bottle. There's like a broken bottle sticking out of the bank. And we pulled out the bottle, and there was a key in there. And it was keys in England. You have various names. Yale. You can have a Yale lock, but this was Squire. This key was, the company was Squire. And we're heading back. We're going down the river, going back to Oxford. And I see someone that I know. I see them from quite a while ago, and he was a Oxford mathematician, and he lives in the countryside, and he lives in a very old house in a village. And that kind of house, you could say, would be the house of a squire. So, you know, the squire. So you have the lord. He would live in a big mansion. The lord would live in a big mansion, but the squire could just live in a big country house, and he did. I'd actually been there because it was haunted, and I'd actually been there as well. But anyway, so we matched, in my mind, I matched him with the squire. And we got talking, and he mentions The Circles of Time by Kenneth Grant. He's got this book. And Kenneth Grant was a protege of Aleister Crowley. And I don't know if he's still alive, but certainly, you know, he could well be alive. But, and he's linked to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and the people in Oxford would have known him very, very close to him. And I think he put articles in the Non-Duality magazine as well. And he had borrowed the book from the head of the Hermetic Order. As I say, I knew him. I actually spent some time with him. I'd been to his house. In fact, we went to his house, and my friend read out the article to him while we were at the house. And he said that, and we mentioned that we were very into synchronicity, because we had spent some time in Soho, London before that, and we were very into synchronicity and Jung. And we had an amazing synchronicity with a scarab beetle, and that's what we wrote about in the Non-Duality magazine. So we're walking along, and he's saying, well, you know, the scarab is like a very important motif in the book, in the circles of time. And we were walking along, and we were about to say goodbye. He was going off somewhere, and we were carrying on down the path. And then we noticed something on his clothing. So on his coat, there was an insect, and we look at it, and it was a one-horned scarab. And I don't know how rare they are in that area, but I've never seen one before. But it was a one-horned scarab. So we had this scarab thing in the book, and then we had these whole series of scarab synchronicities not long before that. And so if we go back a couple of years, or not that long, but I was just sitting with my eyes closed, and I felt myself looking up towards the crown of my head, and I saw this kind of white cocoon and this black beetle crawling out of it. Another one I had, another visualization, was that in front of my eyes was like this black jagged hole. I mean jet black jagged hole. And I felt like my consciousness was being drawn into that black hole. And it's quite shocking. And then this beetle crawled over the hole, as if to prevent me from going into the hole, like protecting me. Well, we found out, or I found out, that it was the scarab beetle, the Egyptian scarab beetle. And scarab beetles are seals on doors, and like if you've got a box with something in, you know, it's an amulet, and it seals the door and wards off evil. So it's to protect you from evil. So you could say the black jagged hole signified evil in some way, black magic, evil. And of course we are involved with all the Golden Dawn and black magic and all of that kind of stuff at the time as well. So we thought we'd go to the museum, the Ashmoleum, and have a look in the Egyptian room, see what we can find. And so my friend notices a sarcophagus of a songstress, a beautifully painted sarcophagus, and on the lid, at the crown of her head, was a beetle in a blue lotus. So just where I'd seen the beetle at the crown of my own head was the beetle in the lotus. And of course, if you look at the Tantric yoga, then the at the crown of the head is the seventh chakra, which of course signifies the 1,000-petaled lotus. So both in Egypt and in Tibetan Buddhism, they use the lotus system. And it's interesting that the guy that ran the Golden Dawn, he was very into Tantric yoga. That was his specialty. In fact, he was a scholar in Sanskrit, so he really knew the Tantric tradition in India very well. And one night I had a dream. And I was in this big hall, and I think it was painted white, and there were huge scarabs, really massive black scarabs hanging on the wall, like you would have sculpture or painting hanging on the wall. They were hanging all around the wall. And then I saw my friend at a table, and there was like a graph paper, and he was doing something on the graph paper. So the next morning I tell him about the dream, and he goes out of the room, comes back in with the graph paper, and he was doing a drawing of my theory on synchronicity, which I called the synchronistic continuum, which is still unpublished, but I had a theory of synchronicity, and in fact he cited that. He actually discussed it in one of his books called The Revelations of Chance, and it was based on his PhD, and it mentions Professor David Bohm and Krishnamurti, and I met both of those people, and he discusses my work a bit in there, and he brings out this graph paper with 3 circles, because they're like 3 levels. I was discussing 3 levels, and he made it into a scarab. He actually found that the shape of the scarab beetle was in the 3 circles. So he actually outlined the scarab beetle on the graph paper with the circles, and I'd seen him with the graph paper and the scarabs the night before, and that became our logo, because we set up a publishing thing and we called it, anyway, it was based on the scarab, and if we go back to 1986, I was at the Krishnamurti school for the duration of the conference, which lasted about 10 days, and I used to stay in the school. It was a big white mansion, and I knew the principal of the school, and I used to go down there in the school term sometimes, and so I was listening to Krishnamurti in the marquee giving his talk, and there are people from all over the world. I mean, they came and they camped out, built a fire, playing the guitars, very hippie, very hippie-like, commune, that kind of thing. And I was into all of that at the time, you know, squatting and living in Wales and various parts of England, doing arts and crafts and that kind of thing. And I just noticed a couple of young guys, you know, sitting there, and I think they had their back to me, and I just focused on this one particular person, this guy's head, just while the talk was going on. And I just had the thought, this guy's really intelligent, you know. I just, you know how you talk about the skull and phrenology and reading the skull, but I wasn't into anything like that. But I just, you know, I just had this actual thought that this guy's intelligent. And I must have seen their faces, you know, I must have seen their faces, but I didn't give it any thought. That was it, over. And that was near Winchester in Hampshire, near the south coast. And it's about, I'd say, 80 miles from Oxford. So I go back to Oxford and I'm standing in my room, looking out at the street. So the conference ends around the early September. So this was probably after term started at the university, probably it was in October. And I was just standing there, and this guy rides by on his bicycle, the one I thought was intelligent. He just rides by, and I thought, wow, that's interesting. And he could have been from anywhere, but you know, he was in Oxford. I had a friend who was an aristocrat. He was head of the Rudolf Steiner Centre in Oxford, and he was also, he established the Centre for Autism as well. I didn't know much about autism at that time. And he also had the centre, the Rudolf Steiner Centre, in a bookshop in Jericho with this guy, the mathematician that I had the scarab stuff with later, but I'd already knew him. So I say to this guy, he's much older than me, he's probably in his late 50s, I'm probably in my mid-30s, a bit older. And I say, well, I'd like to give a workshop, you know, on consciousness, and I called it Consciousness in Everyday Life, consciousness. And I made some posters, hand by hand. I just made posters, and had a few printed up, and I just took them to a few alternative places. There was an alternative cafe, Uhuru's, which is African for freedom. I worked there for a while in the early 70s in a community food shop and cafe. And I put them up in a few places, that's all. I was going down the high street, and I saw this guy again, this young guy. And I said to him, I don't know if you're interested, but I saw you at Krishnamurti conference and I'm giving a workshop. If you're interested, why don't you come along? And he said, maybe he would. Anyway, he does turn up. And the workshop was at St. Giles' Friends Meeting House. And it was literally next door to where I used to hang out in the cafe. And it was a lovely garden room. So you know, it's all these windows, a lovely garden. And I used to put the chairs in a circle, and I'd just sit there, and really it was about just being aware, being quiet, being aware, and just saying what you wanted to say, and just discuss whatever the people. So there was a mixture of men and women. There's some people from the university, some older people, alternative people, big range. And it went on for quite a long time. I think it went on for about 12 sessions, one each week. And I didn't make any money. People just gave enough money to like pay for the room. And at the end of it, during it, I became best friends with this guy. He was in his final year at Exeter College, and he was studying classics. And in fact, he was very intelligent. He's got one of the highest IQs in England. And he's got a scholarship and everything. And in fact, he took a couple of years out when he was 20 and went to live in Glastonbury and got into the occult and Crowley. And he wanted to be a poet. And, you know, so he's very, in a sense, when we met and we kind of compared our background, in terms of the books we've read, they're more or less identical. Gurdjieff and Uspensky and various other things. Very, very, and of course Krishnamurti and everything. So we had a lot in common. So we immediately were talking in a way that was very integrated. And he was, as I say, quite knowledgeable on magic already. And I didn't know anything about magic at that time, really, only about a few symbols and things. So I didn't even know about the scarab and stuff like that. And 1988, a year or so later, he came into some money from his father, and he said, what should we do? And I said, well, let's go and live in London. Let's go to Soho. Let's live in London. And of course, I'd already been to Soho, the Colony Club with this guy, and I know that Soho, it used to be the red light district for like prostitutes, and it was very arty. So there was a lot of film stuff there. It was close to the West End, and all the theatres were there and everything. And there's Piccadilly. It was close to the National Museum. So anyway, we got on a train, literally right away. We got on the train and stayed the night in the station, Paddington Station, when we got to London. And then we went walking around Soho. It's quite a small area. It's in Westminster 1. And Westminster, of course, are the Houses of Parliament. So where the government is, on the Thames River. So you've got the Houses of Parliament, and that's in Westminster 1. And we were right in the centre. We were where everything's happening in Soho. And then you've got Chinatown. And so we're walking around the streets, and in England, if things are very local, and you just got a room or you got a flat you want to rent, you put it in the shop window. So you know in Oxford, if you wanted a room, a quick room, you go and look in the shop window, and there's a card, and it tells you there's a room for rent or something. So we saw this like flat for rent, and we go there, and it's brilliant. And it's under Centrepoint, and Centrepoint is like, I guess I don't know if it's official, but I think it's the centre of London, because it's in Westminster, it's in the centre, so I assume it's the centre of London, and 4 very important roads connect there. And one of them is Oxford Street, so we got this Oxford connection, this Oxford Street, and it's in a road, a small road called Denmark Street, and right across the road is Foyle's, which I think used to be the biggest bookshop in England, and we lived above the Tin Pan Alley recording studios, which is where music. I think it's based on one in New York, and it's where the pop music in the 50s and 60s, 70s, all that used to be recorded in the basement, and the rock bands and people like that. And on the ground floor was acoustic guitars and electric guitars, and upstairs were agents for like pop music. I remember the Cleaners from Venus was one of the groups there, and Sheena Easton was a Scottish pop singer quite famous. And we got this flat, and it was where the Sex Pistols, that very famous punk group called the Sex Pistols, had lived there before, so we were kind of like living there. And I knew my friend could visualize, and I hadn't practiced any meditation. I've never really practiced any kind of astral stuff or out of the body or anything like that. But I thought, well, if he can visualize, and we're on a kind of journey, it was a kind of magical little journey, little drama we were on. And so he sat there and visualized, and I wrote down what he was what he was doing. And he was going back to some ancient past and these sun worship. Well, you see, at that time, I didn't know anything about ancient aliens and ancient Atlantis and all. I didn't know about that. So I haven't kept a record of it, but it would have been very interesting to actually have kept a record of what he was seeing. And he didn't take it too seriously. I mean, he never documented his visualizations, so he could do it since he was a child. But he never took it seriously, and even today, he's a professor in Synchronicity Jung, world-famous professor and scholar, and yet he never takes his visualization seriously, and he could be tapping into all kinds of arcane, esoteric things in the past, or remote viewing and stuff like that. He knows all about remote viewing and psychical research. He was in the Psychical Research Society and gave talks on synchronicity and all kinds of things. Anyway, I thought I was writing down what he was saying, and then I thought, well, I'll write something down as well, automatic writing. And I wrote a couple of things down. And one of the things I wrote down was the Bow and Horn Inn, 1773, something like that. The Bow and Horn Inn, 1773. I had no idea what that meant. And then I wrote down a little poetic phrase about the black rose, and that the black rose was torn out of a garden, and it can be redeemed. So somebody like tore the black rose out of an ancient garden, but it can be restored. You know, it can be redeemed. You know, in other words, if a woman's been raped, you know, you can kind of get your revenge, as it were, or you can if there's an evil aspect, you can kind of balance it with something good. You can there's a redemptive thing involved in what I was writing about. And I mentioned on the plains the phallus of Salvador, and I thought of Salvador Dali, and he was into sexual theory, Freudian sexual theory, and he was a surrealist and very interested in the kind of collective unconscious of Jung and mythology and symbols, and expressing deep levels of the psyche in his paintings and everything. And he was Spanish. And I was painting a red rose, a Rosicrucian kind of red rose, and I said to my friend, well, you know, why don't you go ahead to the Chinese tea room by the Chinatown where we used to go, and I'll meet you there later. So I finished the rose, and I go down Charing Cross Road, which leads to the National Museum, and just near Shaftesbury Avenue, where all the theatres are. And I thought I'd go in Cecil Court, which is just a little alleyway, go to Watkins' bookshop. And and I think Watkins is based on Alfred Watkins, who discovered the ley lines. And in his book, The Old Straight Track, talks about ley lines. And he actually shows a little diagram of Oxford, and where the ley lines cross. They're the dragon paths, and they cross at Carfax, which means in Latin where the four roads meet. So we're living under Centre Point, where the four roads meet. So you've got Centre Point is a kind of tower, and where the four roads meet, and one of them's Oxford. And when I was living in Pusey Street, where I had all these strange experiences of energy passing through my body, etc., and where I had a synchronicity with moving into the house that I'd already thought about moving into, and I end up moving into that house. That was the closest building to where the ley lines cross. And in London, that was more or less the closest house to that centre where the four roads cross. So anyway, I'm walking down Cecil Court, this little alleyway to Watkins' bookshop, which is esoteric bookshop. It's where, you know, you find books on magic and all of that kind of thing. And above the door, where it says Watkins, you've got an image of Thoth. And Thoth as the ibis, and as the ibis, he's the scribe of the gods. So he's the scribe of the gods that writes the books of the gods, the books of Thoth, and he's the god of the scribe. So if you're an initiate, you're a scribe, and you're learning the secret hieroglyphic language, then he's the god of the scribes. So he's the master, and he's the one. But he's also the god of self-knowledge and the god of wisdom. As above, so below. Wisdom above, knowledge below. So I'm walking down, and I just get this very strong energy, again, a kind of very strong magnetic type of energy. And it's only later I thought about the ley lines, because if you're going along the ley line, there can be this magnetic energy. And it goes from like temple to temple, or church to church, or sacred mound to sacred mound, or Stonehenge to somewhere else. And I felt my head energy pulled to the right magnetically, and I focused on this bookcase in the doorway of an antiquarian bookshop, and I felt drawn down to the bookcase, and as I approached it, my eyes focused on this one book on the second shelf in the middle, and as I looked on the black spine of the book, it said the black rose. So I'd written about the black rose. Within a short period of time, I find this book with the black rose. I open the black rose, and the first chapter is Oxford. So I'm living near Oxford Street, just come from Oxford, and it says Oxford. And the first page says that this young student, Walter, is waiting under the tower at Carfax in Oxford. So that where the ley lines cross, the dragon paths cross, there's St. Martin's Tower, so church tower. And he's waiting at that church tower. So we're living under the tower at the centre. Then this guy's waiting in Oxford. And my house was the closest to the tower in Oxford. And he's waiting for a lady coming by carriage from London to Oxford, and we were deciding whether to leave London because our tenancy had come to an end where we were living. We were wondering whether to find another place in London or go back to Oxford, and we actually did go back to Oxford within a few days. Now it's interesting, this Chinese tea room where I later tell my friend the episode, this tea room, tiny little tea room, and they sell all kinds of different cakes. So they sell different cakes that they make on the premises. And so there's a little bakery, and there's a little it's just a very, very simple place. And we'd been going there for a while, and we walked in, and there were two people there. And two people from Oxford University that I knew in Oxford, and they were introduced to me by the friend who played the Mishkin and played my ego tape, my best friend in Oxford before this guy was my best friend. So, you know, they were friends of his, and I think they were graduates in philosophy, but they were also in cabaret. They used to dress up in cabaret. And now this guy was a filmmaker. He was an avant-garde filmmaker in London. And what happened in Oxford, that when I got to know them, I used to like going to on the high street, the Queen's Lane Coffee House. And it was like an old coffee bar from the 50s, really nice place. And I walked in there one day, and there they were at the table, and they had all over the table were these photographs and pictures. And I said, you wouldn't believe it. I said, because last night I had a dream where I came in somewhere and there were all these photographs and all these things on a table. So we're having a laugh about that synchronicity. So anyway, we go into this Chinese thing, and there these two people are, and he said, would I like to be in a art film? So I wrote a little script and used the tape recording of William Burroughs' voice, because he was talking about these scorpions in ancient Egypt. He's very interested in ancient Egypt and UFOs. So I kind of made a script where I was an Egyptologist and investigating certain things to do with UFOs in Egypt. And at that time, I wasn't really into. I had a couple of UFO experiences, some sightings, and some interesting things that I wrote about a UFO that came true. But you know, I didn't give much thought to the UFO at that time. But anyway, I wrote this little script and everything, and evidently, when I left London, I got a letter from him, and he said I was quite good in the film, but I've never seen the film myself, actually. So anyway, again, you know, just coincident meeting these people, and then we were in a film and so forth and so on. And that was, and you know, then we came back to Oxford, and no, first of all, before that, we used to wander around London. We got to know London very well, going in various cafes, the Cafe Royal, and different places. We used to hang out in lots of different places. So we spend all day walking around and just having lunch or afternoon tea somewhere, and Fortnum and Mason's, and go to various places, the museums and the parks and everything like that. We used to go all over the place. And we're walking along, and we just discovered the headquarters of the Freemasons. I didn't know anything about Freemasonry. I think maybe my friend knew a little bit. And we asked the doorman, you know, whether we could go in and have a look around. He said, well, usually you can't just walk in there, but there's an exhibition, there's a small exhibition of regalia, Freemasonry regalia. So we go in there, and there's just a couple of small rooms and very nice different ornaments and different things. And in the you know, probably from about, say, the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, when in London the Freemasons used to meet in inns and pubs, various inns and pubs. And on the wall they had all the lodges, all the names of the lodges where they used to meet. And one of them was the Bow and Horn Inn, 1773, pretty much around that day. And that's exactly what I wrote down in the automatic writing. It was exactly that, the Bow and Horn Inn. I had no idea it was anything to do with Freemasonry or lodges or anything like that. So that's another massive synchronicity that we had in London. And when we came back to Oxford, we had somewhere to stay for a few days before we found a place to rent. And someone comes knocking on the door, and it's an old friend of my friend's who was like really into the occult and knew all the people in the Golden Dawn and everything. I think he's part Egyptian. And he brought a book along called The Black Goddess. Well, in the Black Rose book, the Black Rose of the title is the name of the woman in the book. And what happens is that the student and his friend in Oxford, like me and my friend actually, it's a local boy, because I grew up in Oxford, so I was a local boy and he was the student. Well, in the book there was a local boy and the student, and they meet this Friar Bacon, who was an alchemist and an early scientist, and he did work on optics, and he lived in a place called the Tower on Folly Bridge, just down the road from Carfax, the centre of the town, over the River Thames. So he lived on this place called Folly Bridge, and there was a tower which was his astronomical observatory, and he was also an astrologer and an alchemist, and in fact he was considered a demonologist by the Catholic Church as a friar. And he meets these two students, and he sends them on a quest to the east, to the Far East, to China, which is known as Cathay. And on the way they meet this Miriam, I think her name is, based on, you know, the name Mary. And when they get to China, they all go to China. And when they get to China, they meet like different sages and some interesting things to do with alchemy. And one of the sages says, the girl that they met, Miriam, reminds him of the clove, the black clove, you know, and he calls her the Black Rose. So that was the Black Rose. And then we get this book called The Black Goddess by Peter Redgrove. He's a Cornish poet, into the occult, quite a famous poet. So we had this Black Rose coincidence as soon as we got back to Oxford. And my friend, my nephew, just finished doing his degree in, no, he's on vacation from Sussex University in Brighton near London, doing his degree in artificial intelligence. And I said, well, why don't you come along? We're going to meet this guy in North Oxford. And we're going back around the back streets, and suddenly this black cat jumps out and nearly trips us all over. We're laughing and we're kind of almost falling to the ground. It just cut right across our feet. And within a week, looking for a room, we actually found a house, and it was the house where the black cat came out of. So, you know, we have this synchronicity with the black cat pointing out where we're going to live. And next door was a quantum physicist, Dana Zohar, who wrote a book called The Quantum South. And she studied at MIT, where they do a lot of artificial intelligence in America. And I think she was at Princeton University, where Einstein was. And she was a colleague of Professor David Bohm that I've met with Krishnamurti, actually had talks with him. And he was at Birkbeck College in London University, and David Bohm actually experimented with Uri Geller. And so we carried on, and and before that, that house that we moved into, if you draw a line from that house straight across, in a sense horizontally across North Oxford, it cuts through a road, Polstead Road, and I lived there in 1976 in the house of Lawrence of Arabia, and I had my first UFO experience there. And if you draw the line further across, that's the Celia Green's Institute for Psychophysical Research. She coined the term lucid dream, and that's where I studied out-of-the-body apparitions. So if you draw a straight line, the three houses almost connect, and they're on the Woodstock Road. And of course, I lived in Woodstock near New Paltz in America, and so that goes to Woodstock, where Churchill lived. He was born in Blenheim Palace in Woodstock. And then you've got the Banbury Road, and they're ley lines that come from the centre of the city. In Alfred Watkins' book, The Old Straight Track, he shows the ley lines going north from the centre, and they go right in that area. So more or less where Celia Green doing Out of the Body, where I had the UFO experience in the Lawrence of Arabia's house, and then there's this quantum physicist, and her colleague worked with Uri Geller and had all these synchronicities, all taking place in the sense of the ley line. So anyway, we carry on walking, we go to meet this friend, we go in this pub, and he's with a group of people, and my friend asked this girl whether she'd like a drink, and she said yes, cider and black. And it turns out her name is Rosa, and she's a goth, and she's all dressed in black. So she becomes the Black Rose. And then later my friend asks her what kind of brooch is she wearing. And she said, oh, that's a fairy brooch in the shape of a fairy. And I call it Gala, who's the wife of Salvador Dali. So we have this Black Rose thing with the phallus of Salvador. So you have the black rose is female, the Salvador Dali, the phallus is male, and then suddenly we have this goth girl in black, and named Rosa. So that's the kind of thing went on in Oxford and continues to this day. That these kind of dramas are like part of the fabric of my life. I mean, this is my typical life. This is my lifestyle, as it were. I think that will do for today.